right, so hi everyone. Kimberlin Butler here. So excited to join you. And I want to thank the Global Possibility Network at University of Pennsylvania for making this opportunity and very relevant conversation possible. Whenever we're talking about young people, it's always relevant, but in this particular time, I find it particularly important for us to talk as a network. So I wanted to start with a story, and Dr. Mike Nicola knows this, having been my chair in the dissertation process. I love stories because it crystallizes sort of why we're here. Dr. Martin Luther King is one of my favorite leaders in history, and he said, as familiar as it might be to many of you, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And people tend to stop there. My favorite part of that quote is, we are actually caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so he highlights this sort of mutual connection that we're all tied in. And so I, Kimberlin Butler, stand before you today, not just as a scholar, practitioner, and advocate, having come through the illustrious University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, but as a product of the very possibilities we seek to create for young people. I grew up in South Louisiana. I was raised by a single mother and a military father who had an 8th grade education in a community that really believed in lifting as we climb. And I should also mention that my mother had a college education and a college degree. So I started my journey in Head Start, navigating systems that too often define children by their deficits rather than their possibilities. Yet, despite the statistics, I was surrounded by a network of mentors, programs, and intentional investments in my future. And that journey from an underserved community or historically marginalized community, as some would say, to advising two U.S. Secretaries of Education, Arne Duncan and John King, leading White House convenings and launching now the L.E.A.D agency, which I'll talk about in this conversation, it was not an accident. It was a direct result of philanthropic investments in my potential. But for every young person like me, there are thousands more whose genius is overlooked, whose voices go unheard, and whose future is shaped by the absence, not the abundance of possibility. And so that brings me to Maya's story. So if we could go to the next slide. So Maya's story is a case study in missed opportunity for philanthropy. Maya was 12 years old when her world was shattered. She lost both of her parents, and by 17, she was the sole provider for her siblings, navigating the maze of homelessness, school, and survival. And despite these challenges, GPN network, Maya was still brilliant. She was resilient and full of promise. A national nonprofit, though, took notice of her and brought her into their youth leadership program. And soon she became a celebrated voice in philanthropy, speaking on panels. In fact, she and I met because we spoke on a national stage for the Grantmakers for Education conference. She addressed funders and even shared her story at the White House. Yes, she actually shared her story at the White House. It was pretty powerful for her. So she was held up as the shining example of how philanthropy supports youth, yet behind the scenes, her reality remains the same. First, Foundation celebrated her resilience, but didn't invest in her stability. 2, she was invited to speak, but not to shape solutions in the systems that had failed her. 3, her story was used as evidence of impact, but she struggled to access the resources for her own survival and her own thriving, as we would aspire for her. Over time, the weight of extraction without investment took its toll on Maya. She suffered from depression, she dropped out of college, and felt increasingly disillusioned by a system that had used her story but never changed her reality. So as Maya told me in my dissertation research, and also in subsequent conversations, because she later became my mentee, I have been the poster child to make others look good, leaving me in survival mode when I deserve to thrive. But her experience is not unique. It's a pattern we see too often where philanthropy misses the opportunity to move beyond storytelling and into true investment, trust, and co-creation with young people. So that is why I developed Youth Possible Philanthropy, a framework that moves philanthropy from transactional relationship with youth to a transformational partnership. Because when young people, GPN, are positioned as co-creators in philanthropy, they don't just participate in change, they actually lead it. So we can go to the next slide.
I'm sorry, Kimberlin. I'm having a hard time with the screen sharing. It keeps saying that it's paused, but I've
If you want
tried
it, can we
I've
shift?
tried a bunch of things to try to unpause it, and it's not working. I'm very sorry for this.
Oh, can we maybe ask someone else to share?
I've asked Jackie to try.
Okay. Hmm.
I am very sorry. I have no idea what's going on. It's
Okay.
I just don't
very frustrating. It says stop share. Your screen sharing is paused.
Hmm.
And I keep pressing resume. It doesn't resume. I've tried stopping to share it and resharing it multiple times. I'm just at the end of my rope here.
If you send it to me in the chat, I don't know why my email isn't loading. So I don't have the files. That's
Oh, I
my,
sent it to everyone. Okay.
no, it's a me problem.
Oh, okay.
Here. We can edit this out, Kimberlin. We'll just do a quick nip tuck. Yeah, I've got one window that says currently sharing, and I've got another window that says your screen sharing is paused. No idea.
Well, it looks like I see something. I just shared Maya's story, so. Does anyone else see what I see? It says, can we go back, please? I'm asking for a response because.
Yeah, let us know which,
Oh,
oh,
I
Every
said,
single time I try to share it, it says your
Andrew,
screen
I'm
sharing
sharing the
is paused.
screen.
Andrew, you should stop sharing because it's working with Jackie.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you.
So I
So
just want to make sure I'm on the right slide.
yeah, I'm answering. So I just shared Maya's story. So that is Maya's story.
Next
Mhm.
slide.
Now it's not showing up on my screen for some reason, so I'm
So,
just going to be
I
quiet.
see it though, so it's fine.
Okay, that's good. All right.
So we're on the screen about missed opportunities, correct? Okay. So the missed opportunity in traditional philanthropy is where I want us to focus now. So despite the billions invested in social impact, philanthropy still largely operates in top-down structures. They treat young people as a sector as beneficiaries rather than partners. And that's the nature of this work. So what's the current landscape? Youth are often engaged for visibility, not influence. They're still asked to tell their stories, as in the case with Maya, but not to co-design the solutions that actually shape their futures. Often we see that funding is short-term and transactional. Many initiatives are anchored in programs. As we are aware, when funders give away grants, it's usually tied to a program instead of investing in the systems level change that aligns with youth aspirations. And then also the power dynamics in philanthropy still remain pretty adult-centric. So many funders, they hesitate to trust young people's expertise, as I discovered in my dissertation research, that despite their lived experience being the best indicator of what actually works. And so if we shift to the next slide, I want to give you an example of the power of trust. So one foundation I studied shifted from youth advisory panels to youth-led grant making, and it allowed young leaders to actually shape how funds were distributed and also the strategy behind what those funds would actually do and the results might be. And co-creating with young people was pretty powerful for the foundation and for the young people themselves. So as a result, the funder determined that it was actually more effective to have young people engage, and they were able to shape community-driven solutions that outperform the adult-designed initiatives, and the adults meaning the adults in the foundation and other adults in the foundation's network. So in the next slide, I want to talk about the solution, which is what I'm calling youth possible philanthropy. I believe that it is time to reimagine with a framework that positions young people and leaders as decision makers in shaping funding strategies. And so the core principles of Youth Possible Philanthropy actually include the work of Dr. Mike Nicola, thank you, possibility development, which is about aligning youth aspirations with systemic opportunities. And an example there would be a funder who actually embedded youth in governance and saw not only stronger decision-making, but increasing youth engagement in community leadership. A second principle of Youth Possible Philanthropy is actually equity-centered leadership. It's thinking about centering historically resilient youth as leaders. Notice the asset framing that I'm using, which is a major trend in philanthropy to make sure we define young people by their aspirations and the systems that have actually harmed them, as opposed to positioning them as just victims. And so I am calling them historically resilient young people because that's what they are. And that's true for my story. They're not just participants sort of passively engaging in philanthropy and experiencing their investments, but they're actually taking the lead and driving and shaping what they are. So that requires equity-centered leadership. So an example of that would be a foundation engaging youth from foster care to actually redefine outcomes for transition age youth, ensuring that grant making reflected their actual needs. A major foundation in my study is actually seeing the promise of engaging youth experiencing the foster care system and also justice impacted youth. Another principle of Youth Possible Philanthropy is strategic co-creation. So this is engaging youth in funding decisions and not just storytelling. And so, for example, a participatory grant-making initiative engaged youth to decide how to allocate $2 million, and that led to higher impact and community-driven investments. And so co-creating the participatory nature of grant making, as well as participatory philanthropy more broadly, was really fundamental for the young people as well as the foundation. And then finally, something that doesn't happen at all more broadly in the philanthropic sector and across multiple systems is that those systems and sectors actually need to collaborate. I can't tell you in my career how many times I have brought parties together that don't usually talk. And so it shows how siloed sectors are, right? Even though GPN is seated in the Department of Education at Penn, you know, how often does that division actually talk to the social impact division? That's just in a university context. Well, think about writ large in the sector, a lot of sectors, healthcare, education, youth, human services, and you name it, are not talking. And so what does it mean to have multi-sector collaboration for the most promising young people to actually realize their possibilities? So a core principle here is aligning philanthropy with education, workforce, policy, and other systems not named here. And an example would be a foundation invested in youth-led education reform. And so that led to policy shifts that expanded access to career pathways for youth that are resilient in New York City. And I could go into other examples of that, but those are the core principles. And so as we shift to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about what Youth Possible Philanthropy actually is. And so as you can see on the slide, it's a anchoring approach that guides our work through the lens of commitment to creating space for resilient voices in youth participatory practices in philanthropy. And so we envision a world where investments catalyze communities and youth to actually lead, which is an acronym that stands for, you know, creating space for them to learn, you know, excel and continue to push toward achievement, but also discover their destiny or their purpose. And so I wanted to just kind of just bring you to what that is. It's truly transformative when you think about how the work of possibility development sort of merges with philanthropy and the best of models that currently exist in participatory grant making, philanthropy, what's also known as trust-based philanthropy. It's an opportunity to go directly to young people and hear from them and engage them in a very systematic way on a continuous basis in every nature of trust there is. So next slide, please. And so here I wanted to just give you some insight on a model that still has to be tested, quite frankly, right? And so I am a part of a cohort. If you ever look up for professional development, emergent learning. I just joined the cohort and I'm so excited because emergent learning allows you to partner with people and groups to actually develop and co-design and sort of, continue to tweak. And so this is very iterative. So it's taking the best theories in philanthropy and also possibility development to sort of center on youth possible philanthropy. So let's look to the top left. You have youth participatory grant making. And here the imperative is youth actually help make funding decisions, right? So that's nothing new. That's been happening in philanthropy for quite a while, over a decade, actually. And there are several foundations, actually hundreds, who have tried this and they're doing this, right? But if you look to the right, trust-based philanthropy is something more recent. And the imperative here is that foundations need to trust the organizations they're investing in and the communities that know best how to use their funding, right? And it sort of moves beyond just the transactional, grant reporting operations that you see in philanthropy historically, and sort of anchors in trust. And so program officers and foundation leaders are now working directly with organizations to actually have more iterative conversations about what that might look like. But then you sort of bring it to the middle where you center young people as co-creators of the philanthropic governance, meaning the boards of foundations are actually making decisions around where funds are actually invested. Imagine creating space for young people to have not only seats on that board, but thinking about the strategy of what gets invested in across the entire foundation's strategy of investments and impact and portfolio. That is sort of how you get down into youth possible philanthropy. And then if I draw your attention down to the bottom left, you'll see that possibility development, which we know so well in this network, connected to participatory learning, is what allows for young people to actually learn in the process of co-creating these investments. So this sort of like internal psychological opportunity for them that Dr. Nakula talks about and the whole network connects it to their experience partnering with young people to shape sort of the value add for them in the process, but also thinking about the systems that they're sort of designing goals and philanthropic investments around. And then here on the right, bottom right, it's the multi-sector collaboration and the equity-centered approach kind of working together to think about the societal norms and how we get to sort of tackle structural inequities through youth possible philanthropy. So what I'm saying is this extends the best of a lot of networks around participatory engagement and youth and grant making and philanthropy to sort of center on something more broadly and holistically, consistently called youth possible philanthropy. You can go to the next slide. And so an example of youth possible philanthropy in action is this notion of, it's this notion of youth-led initiatives that I mentioned earlier with the grant-making program allocating $2 million. So I actually talked about this already, so I just wanted to give an example. So we can go to the next slide. So the path forward, in my opinion, having worked on this for quite a while, is that, we have to move funders. And when I say funders, I mean every type of foundation that exists, from community foundations, private philanthropy, big family foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and even smaller ones, any foundation you can think about that's organized where there's an endowment. Youth need to be in decision-making spaces and not just on panels. So moving from this notion of inclusion to actually true integration, I think there's room to redefine impact. And so an article that will be released soon in the spring will talk about, how we need to center youth-defined success metrics, and not just funder-driven KPIs. And so thinking about how young people can co-design metrics to measure success is going to be truly important, because a lot of the insights from the interviews that I conducted in the dissertation talked a lot about how we think we know what we're measuring, but we don't really know how to get into the heads of young people. And so how do you do that? You have to ask them. And so creating a system and a sort of platform and space to do that well is what I'm offering and inviting us to do here. And then we have to fund for the future, not just the present. You have to look beyond the horizon and invest in long-term youth-led initiatives that actually challenge systemic inequities. That's the key. It's not just about episodic grant making. It's not just about episodic programs, but truly thinking about engaging young people in long-term systemic inequities. And then finally, like, we have to bridge sectors. We have to break down those silos and leverage philanthropy's convening power, because they can bring together so many groups and so many sectors just by nature of the history of philanthropy. And they're not sort of, you know, tied by the traditional sort of government federal crisis that's happening right now. So there's a lot of room for creativity in the philanthropic sector to align youth-driven philanthropy with workforce development, education, policy, community, healthcare systems, et cetera. So the next slide, please. So I wanted to just have us think about a quick reflection. You know, philanthropy means love of humanity, but I want to invite you to think about how we cannot claim to love young people in philanthropy while refusing to trust them at the same time, right? That's a dichotomy that we're faced with, that if we truly love humanity and think about the resilient young people that we're trying to support here and sort of allow them to step into their power, which we know they have, we need to think about building a future where every young person can thrive. And so philanthropy must be willing to share power, co-create solutions with young people, and fund youth-led transformation. And so the future of philanthropy is really not about us, it's about them. And so the question is, you know, are we ready to follow their lead? So let's go to the next slide. So here's where I want to invite us, before we get into the discussion, to thinking about our roles in advancing youth possible philanthropy. So for funders and philanthropic leaders, if I were talking to them in this conversation, it would be moving beyond traditional grant making to supporting youth-led initiatives and governance models. Like, how do you create space? And then the article that will be released, I'm sharing with the field specific concrete strategies for the field to actually do that in the foundation review. Secondly, for policymakers and social impact leaders like myself, it's aligning policy and funding mechanisms with youth-driven solutions to create that long-term systemic change. And just like in policy, you have to engage communities if you're trying to deliver on the promise of the policy that you want implemented. The same holds true for listening to young people as policies are being shaped in every sense of the word, whether it's federal, state, and local policy making. And then for this audience, because we're researchers and academic leaders, you know, developing new frameworks for measuring youth impact that center their agency. There is such an opportunity that's rich here, even amid all the socio-political challenges. Everyone cares about young people, right? And so thinking about how research and academia can support systemic change and long-term sustainability by co-designing those opportunities for youth-defined metrics, creating space for young people to do that in partnership with philanthropy. There are several strategic learning offices and foundations that could use that augmented support to think about what that looks like. And then finally, you can't do this work without young people, right? And they actually should be first when we think about young people and the communities where they sit. You know, they need to demand a seat at the table. And when they get there, bring more chairs, because it's really about them. And so I want to invite us to think about, how do we catalyze those possibilities together? Next slide, please. And so for our Q&A and discussion, I want us to pause and have a conversation. One, hear your reactions to everything I just shared, but I want to structure some of our conversations, because I said this work is iterative, and so it will evolve and get better and better, right? But we have to test and invite foundations to practice this. So in the spirit of moving toward possibility and practice, what barriers exist in your organization, wherever you sit, right? If it's academia, if it's, you know, any place you sit, maybe you volunteer in the world, to implementing youth-led philanthropy, or youth possible philanthropy, as I'm calling it. Two, how can funders balance youth leadership with accountability, right? There are some limitations that are yet to be discovered, but you can imagine what those limitations might be. One, for sure, being trust, right? This is different. This doesn't happen often. So what do you think, you know, how can funders think about that and balance that? Number three, what are examples of successful youth-driven initiatives that you've seen in this global possibility network and in the work you've done? And fourth, how can youth-driven philanthropy align with broader equity and systemic change goals? And so I want us to pause and think about that, and I want to hear your reactions.
I can start us out, Kimberlin.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I'm just struck by your dedication to youth-driven work. It's at a level beyond what I typically think of in these terms, including my own, actually. You clearly have tremendous trust in young people's capacities to help move work forward. This isn't really a question that's on the board here exactly, but it's related to it, I think. The question that I have is, how did you develop that level of trust? Where does that come from for you?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That means a lot coming from you. So I developed that trust when I saw in middle school, actually, I joined something called the Youth Legislature, sponsored by the YMCA in my community. Like I said, I'm from Baton Rouge, South Louisiana. Most of my family's New Orleans. Happy Mardi Gras, by the way. Mardi Gras was Tuesday. Have to do that here. But when youth legislature was an opportunity for us to get exposed to what it means to develop legislation. And it was like a youth leadership program. And I remember learning how a bill became law as a middle schooler. I was 12 years old. I was in middle school, and I had a very unique challenge in my family. My uncle he had lung cancer. And I was thinking about, how did he end up with lung cancer? And he was a smoker. And he died a couple of years ago, but at that time he wasn't near death. And so, but I was thinking about, well, how did he get here? And so as a young person, I was intrigued by the social condition and health condition he was in. And so I decided to study secondhand smoke and just smoking in my own household, but also just, what that had done to expose him and his lungs. And so as a young person in that program, I decided to sponsor a bill, and, in the local paper, got some traction. He's a young person who's taking seriously this notion of secondhand smoke, right? And I saw my leadership connected to a direct challenge in my own world, in my own environment. And I saw that I had agency to do something about it, created by this youth legislature sort of program. And so you had a diverse array of voices. There weren't many Black students in this program. So I learned to work with all kinds of cultures and backgrounds. And if you think about the state of Louisiana, and you have students from all over the entire state, and we're learning how a bill becomes law, we're learning how to shape a bill, we're learning how to get a bill out of committee. I learned how to filibuster. I learned everything in this program. And my bill ends up passing, and in theory, right, it was a youth program, but in theory, it would sort of ban how smoking is happening in different communities and restaurants, and sort of secondhand smoke, how it would impact people. And so for me, the fact that an entity trusted my voice to sort of elevate and amplify and study that issue mattered. And although it was a simulation, it reminded me back then about, how I could carry that story throughout my entire life. And so it made me a resilient young person, but it also showed me that I had the power as a young person to transform what was happening in the lives of adults and the community writ large around me. So if I was trusted, I said, oh gosh, other young people should be trusted, because there are a myriad of challenges in the world that can be attended to, but we have to just trust young people to actually realize that they can actually think for themselves. I could think as a young person using my eyes and what was happening around me. And if that's just one issue, imagine the other issues that are happening around us, and the potential to sort of engage with people that didn't look like me in that one setting, right? We've come so far as a world now. That was so long ago, but that trust in me showed me that young people deserve trust, in the world. So if that answers your question, I hope that makes sense.
It does, in a big way, that has started in your own life. You experienced this yourself as a young person.
Absolutely.
I mean, I could go so many different ways with this. I find it all so compelling. But I want to try to answer one of your questions. What examples have you seen where youth leadership transformed a community? I can't say I've seen an example where it's transformed a community, but I saw the potential for it to transform a community if we trusted and empowered young people more. And I'll give you an example of that. I often use this example. During the COVID, the peak of COVID, when mental health issues were really getting deeper in schools, the best response I saw to that was a youth-led initiative in a high school, where the young people themselves said, essentially, the adults don't understand the impact this is having on us, and they don't see the mental health issues we're struggling with. So a collection of young people created a working group, and they led the mental health promotion for their high school. And if the adults had led it, I don't think it would have been as effective, because they didn't really understand the issues as deeply. This group of youth leaders reached out to their peers to get more information on what they were experiencing and what was needed. When I say that didn't really transform the community, I think adults got in the way of that peaking as much as it could have. But I really did see the power of what youth can do relative to adults in certain contexts.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, because young people just bring such fresh, relevant perspective, and you can always count on them because they're, the world is evolving and they're still here, right? And I think, frankly, they're the best hope for what's happening now that I don't have to name in the world, So that's why you'll never lose betting on young people, because they are truly the most relevant chance for making the world a better place. And I appreciate that granular example. I told Dennis, and I told Jackie, and Andrew knows this, that I am very inclusive. And as a teacher, I am not going to allow this conversation to go by without your voice, because you're in the network, which means you have some voice in the network. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, either reflecting on one of these questions or just your own thoughts to make this work better as I think about it from a ground perspective.
I would love to contribute. Thank you, Kimberlin, for your presentation for this work. It had my brain buzzing for sure, especially since I've worked in college access my entire career. And so a lot of my roles have depended on philanthropy and the funding of others. And I think even the example you gave of youth legislature, it's a form of experiential learning, and seeing that that's such a need for young people, of not only helping students explore their authentic interests, but equipping them with opportunities to experience hands-on learning and reflect, oh, this shaped my lens about this field. Let me pivot in this way. And so seeing that that's something that's super needed. But I also think about the idea of philanthropy within greater systems, but then within the context of when youth are engaging in philanthropy in the context of college admissions work, and how oftentimes it's universities saying that we want students that engage with their community, but I've seen students who build the nonprofit or build the organization merely as a marker on their college application that they did something, and not with the incentive of building systemic change. And so it makes me think a lot about the ideas, the role of nonprofits in this, and how it's really interesting that people like when philanthropy is palatable to them. And what would it look like for systemic change to happen? It would cause something to shift that might make people in power feel uncomfortable. So this idea of nonprofits co-opting social change is something that also plays into this that I find super interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because as I mentioned in another world where I was speaking, people forget that nonprofit organizations need philanthropy just as much as philanthropy needs nonprofit organizations, because the IRS requires that funders actually give a percentage of their dollars away. And that's just sort of baseline, right? Funders have the creativity and the opportunity to do so much more, and there's nothing saying they can't. But how do you do that? Nonprofits are sort of like the brains and the most proximate to the challenges that funders are investing in. So, and even intermediaries sort of in the middle where a GPN might play a role, right? There's such a unique opportunity to drive systems change or systemic change, but you have to be in conversation, and there has to be structured opportunity to think about that in the college admissions example you gave. And then, you know, young people play such a role in not just sort of checking a box for college admission, but what would happen if their stories were used to sort of amplify themes and issues around their experiences along the college journey when you're talking about access and even completion, even into the workforce. There's such a range of possibilities, not to play on that word, but like seriously, you raised something very interesting there. How do we go from, you know, just sort of checking a box, but actually, you know, leveraging nonprofit organizations more systemically in partnership with philanthropy and not just like as a grantee, right? There's so much, and most grantees and nonprofits don't realize the incredible power they actually have to drive real systemic change. They think so myopically in just about like grants, right? It's so much deeper than that. You're actually changing systems and sectors. And that's what I'm inviting us to think higher and think broader. And there's an entire world, which this network knows very well, right? That could use that level of thinking. I have more slides, but I want to get others in. Andrew, if you have thoughts about one of these questions, thank you so much. And Dennis, feel free. Go, Dennis. Yeah. I hope I'm saying your name right. Is it Denise or Dennis?
It's Denise, yeah.
Oh, Denise. Denise. That's my middle name, Denise. You just have a Z.
So like thank you so much for, you know, all of these like mindful questions. And what I have what I have been getting is, you know, for me as an immigrant, and like someone who had to navigate the unfamiliar systems, you know, I know firsthand how much these systems weren't built with, you know, for young people, for young folks like me in mind, you know, especially youth from immigrant families, low income backgrounds, or communities of color. I feel like youth-driven philanthropy can be it is such a powerful tool because for these communities, like real decision-making power. And when when youth led, they focus on the root causes, you know, finding solutions that reflect their lived experiences, and, you know, just challenging who typically holds power in philanthropy. You know, it's not sometimes, you know, it's just not about like funding the projects, but it's also about shifting power and building leadership. So I think youth can drive lasting change in these communities. Yeah.
Love it. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. That's literally the point of it all. Really appreciate that. Yes. So much power in youth participation. And once we trust them, it unleashes a world of possibilities. I appreciate that, Denise. Andrew, any thoughts before we move on? And if not, no pressure.
I have a lot of thoughts because your presentation was so thought-provoking, and I really appreciate it. Like Mike said, I mean, I think the level of I don't know, sophistication and also responsiveness to the realities of the situation is incredible. And you're really, in my opinion, you're leading the way here to play on the name of your agency. So I have a couple of anecdotes, and I'm going to try to be brief. So I think about my experience in South Africa, which was that young people were at the forefront of leading social change in South Africa, and it did not happen overnight. But the African National Congress was very intentional about having a youth league early on. And so the ANC Youth League was able to cultivate future leaders. So where I worked in South Africa was a historically black university there, one of the handful that was created by the apartheid government for black students. And the birth of the Black consciousness movement um, actually owes a lot to the student community at that very university. It was called the University of the North. Now it's called the University of Limpopo. And so my experience in South Africa and working with youth there really opened my eyes to what was possible both historically and in the present. There were very politically active student groups on the campus, even when I worked there. Now, this is 15 something years ago, but I'm sure that those groups are still quite active. So that's one anecdote. I want to tell you another anecdote that's a little closer to home. So I'm on the school board of my local school district, and I've been on there now for, it's my 8th year. It's my final year. I'm not running again, but one of the great things about being on the school board is the opportunity to learn from young people. And during COVID, we dealt with mask issues and we dealt with all those very tough decisions, but we also dealt with a proposal from students to change our mascot. So we were known as the Radnor Raiders for decades. And our personification of the mascot was a Native American dressed up in a costume and would run along the sidelines, etc. Now, this trope, this motif of the Red Raider, so to speak, is common, especially among East Coast high schools and school districts. If you look it up, it's actually quite common. So my point is that a number of students got together and wrote a report that really acted as a petition to us, the school board, in the summer of 2020, which was the summer of a real sea change in national awareness of racism, of systemic racism with the George Floyd murder and subsequent protests. And so we were riding a wave of social change that was driven by young people, whether it was the George Floyd protests or this particular action that was taken by a specific group of young people in our community. And so we were forced, as the governing body of our school district, they put us on the back foot. They forced us to confront this issue that had been attempted to be confronted for at least 20 years, right? So there had been, let me say that again, there had been start-stop attempts to force this issue onto the board, but it never got the traction. So this final push by a group of very committed and focused students, it forced us finally to confront this issue. And after a long deliberation, we voted as a board to get rid of the mascot and the name. There had been discussions about getting rid of just the mascot and changing it to a pirate or something like that, like the Oakland Raiders. But the decision was made to uproot the whole thing and to start over. And we did. And we convened a committee to decide upon a new mascot. So I just give those two examples of youth activism and change agents. In South Africa, it was a multi-decade push, right, to really spearhead social change. And young people died in a very public way in that fight in South Africa. But then there's this very, very, very clear example of youth empowered change at our local government level. So what can we do? What can we do as adults? We can follow your lead, Kimberlin, in helping young people and opening the door and empowering them, giving them a seat at the table. It's up to us to directly empower them and to invite them. We can't be passive. We can't wait for them to ask us for advice. We need to explicitly say, we're making a space for you. And I think that what I love about your work, Kimberlin, is that you seem to be really encouraging philanthropic organizations to really make space for young people at the table. So, as I said, I have a lot to say. I hope I wasn't too
No, thank
long-winded there,
you.
but
No,
thank you
those
for
are
that
two.
opportunity.
Oh my gosh, you're welcome. Thanks for those two great examples. I think in America, we focus so much on what's happening here, and I love how you broaden it to, let's remember there are young people all over the world. And so, which means anywhere you sit, there is a role for you in this movement of advancing youth possible philanthropy or engaging young people. Let's go to the next slide, because you're actually centering on sort of like, I want to land on like some of the work and the responsibility that I hold. And so inspired by that youth legislature story, Dr. Nakolo, like I was thinking about like, this company or this social impact firm, if you will, philanthropic engagement firm grew out of that story actually. And so I'm positioning the work as being a trusted partner, because individually I've been in my career a trusted partner to, catalyze possibilities for philanthropy. And so with this agency, I'm saying that there's an opportunity to sort of support philanthropy throughout, the philanthropic life cycle. And most people think about grants, but philanthropic life cycle is so much bigger. It's also, funders have to think about who they're going to partner with, and they require networks and relationships with the broader world and even their communities to understand how are you going to shape investments. It is impossible, literally, to play on the word possibility, to do this work alone, right? And so what I'm trying to position is like some tailored strategies to empower organizations to actually amplify those voices, right? In young people, but also communities writ large. Like, I'm passionate about young people, but my agency is broader than just youth. It's thinking about communities and different types of stakeholders. So the ways we do that is like facilitating equity-centered reform, right, in partnership with philanthropy, but also developing some roadmaps and thinking about measurable outcomes, because this movement toward funders wanting to make measurable impact is very important. We've been saying that for years, but it's interesting how folks are like serious about it now, right? And so if you really are serious, you can't just think about the quantitative. You got to think about the stories in the qualitative sense that, I say data has a heartbeat, like what colors the experience around the immigration story that you were sharing, Denise, for example. You need to engage young people to get the full picture, and then elevating youth and the resilient communities where they sit, right? The participatory approaches, so offering that tailored support. And so the next slide will go into some of the core services. So I offer 4 different types of services. So the philanthropic practice consulting is really about helping funders. The audience is truly philanthropy as a client, right? Thinking about how do you shape equity-driven investments, and specifically with young people engaged and in mind, right? And then also strategy advising more broadly beyond young people, just helping think about all the strategies, like whether it's climate change or whether it's something around health or whatever. It's topic agnostic is the point, because young people are everywhere and experiencing everything, right? And so then also funders are struggling with partnership engagement, right? Just because you have an intent or a strategy or a plan to engage partners, you still need groups to think about how to broaden your network and develop those actual partnerships across sectors. So like I mentioned before, my work has seen so much siloed partnership implications. So there's a unique opportunity to bring parties together that don't traditionally work together, and to do it in a very systematic way, not as an episodic one time, but like, for example, if you have a convening, which is the next offering, ironically, after that convening, there should be something prompting you to action and continuous engagement. It shouldn't be, oh, we had a nice convening, let's go home, right? So this network is an example. It started a couple of years ago. We were engaged online with a worldwide network. And then I would imagine built into the plans or over time strategically, you want to continuously engage the network through speaker series like this, but also there should be some action steps that come out of all these speakers, right? To sort of say, here's what we're going to do to uphold what's next as the network. Well, what I'm offering is supporting groups in doing that, and specifically the philanthropy or philanthropic sector in doing that, because they love to think about next steps. And so the final slide is just simply saying, let's catalyze possibilities for young people, right? And this is actually inviting you to partner with me to do that. You've got my email address, which can be shared with the world, and my phone number. It's not my personal number, that's a company number, and then also the website. So I want to thank you guys for letting me be in the network in a way that's thoughtful and strategic. And also I look forward to continued discussions. Young people are the future, and we just have to trust them. Thank you.
Kimberlin, thank you so much for that presentation. It actually gives me chills. And the reason it gives me chills is it feels so right. It's so convincing. I want to underscore what Andrew said. I believe you are taking the lead here and it's important for us to follow that lead for all of us, not just the people on this screen here. I have a question. We have till 12:15.
Yeah, can you stop
Kimberly.
sharing the slides? That'd be great. I want to see all your faces and not my big face. Thank you. Great. Okay,
So here's one question I have. The adults who work in the philanthropic sector are obviously trained. It's not just any adult making decisions in that sector. It's people who are hired and trained and all of that stuff. So how do we go about preparing youth for that responsibility like we prepare the adults for that responsibility?
Yeah, so it's going to require, and these are some of the steps that are coming out in the article. It's going to require sort of a little bit of an infrastructure overhaul, right? If you can't do business the same, right? So one foundation that I can't reveal because they were anonymous in the study, as you know, has started to take the lead on this. And that particular foundation, which is very well known, they have in their operations manual kind of designed a requirement that every staff person, even if you're in the finance division of the foundation or even an executive assistant, just any role, communications, that you understand how to engage with young people, because at any point, young people may come through the doors of that foundation. And so you need to just know some basics around how to engage them. On the other side, there are also groups that are helping the young people where they invest and engage, sort of think about how to not be intimidated. Just like in school systems, like parents are being trained, hopefully, to not be intimidated, engaging school leaders and university administrators. Like, there's a lot of work to be done to prepare young people for engaging as well. And with that comes making sure that they are activated with their own empowering voice. And so tilling the ground to create a lot of safety psychologically. There's also some training there because a lot of the young people have experienced trauma, as you know, which is why I'm calling them resilient youth, because they've been through a lot. And frankly, a lot of adults have been through a lot where they can share and have an exchange. So this is really about strengthening the adult youth sort of dynamic and relationship here. It is not, and I think this is important to emphasize, because a lot of funders who are afraid of this, they just think it's just young people taking over everything. Actually, this is not what this is. This is actually moving from ignoring them and allowing their voices to actually take root and take hold in systemic change, and not feeling transactional, but truly transformative. And what that means, you have to model listening, which means young people need to be prepared to engage well because they've not seen that. And foundations and the adults in foundations need to be prepared to engage well. And also it means foundations need to hire on staff more practitioner-based roles, right? There's a trend with some funders like Bill and Melinda Gates. I have a friend who works there in the economic mobility division. She came straight from social work and social agencies, and they hired her because her firsthand experience with communities and understanding like the practitioner-based necessity, like, you know, she had to have that experience to give away the grants that she's shaping right now. And it has made the work so much more powerful, which means she's more inclined in that seat at Gates to actually trust young people and communities than probably other staff who just didn't have that experience. So there's a trend there to be more practice-based as well. And I would imagine if this work continues to take flight in theory and in practice, there must be space created for young people to end up on staff. So this actually has a lot of implications for like a human capital and how you know, sort of recruit young people that will end up in roles leading philanthropy, quite frankly, over time.
Yeah.
So we can't see that might happen when I'm no longer here in the world, but that's the goal, is for us to create systems and structures to make sure that work outlives us.
Fantastic.
That makes sense.
Thank you, Kim.
You're
Totally.
welcome. We go to 12:15. So let's, I mean, you know, what are some things that you all think, because when the article comes out, I know I keep talking about this article in the Foundation Review, it's going to prompt, it's in the sector category of the publication. So in the sector category is like, make the sector think differently, do something different, et cetera, right? It is also saying it's untested. And that was one, like the reviewers gave me feedback about that, which is so true. I was very open to that feedback because the reality is this is something, it actually prompts foundations to practice, right? And so if you're really serious about engaging young people, and this is an opportunity to think about all of this work as a funder, I'm gonna have to recruit funders to practice this, right? Some are already doing it, so maybe working with the funders who've started doing pieces of it. But the reality is, as we move funders toward practice, we have something to offer, not just as a network, but also we have opportunities to listen to young people in modeling that, right? I don't want us to move so far without engaging young people. So some limitations in this is right now, I've been talking to a couple of young people, but we need more strategic ways to engage young people to actually shape what the future of this looks like. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on, maybe this is another conversation, but I wanted to hear your thoughts to sort of think about how we position, when it's time and there's an opportunity. Let's say I sign up 5 foundations to start practicing this. I would imagine some would respond in that way when it's released in April. What are we going to do, right? What are the unique opportunities? What's the entry point? I have thoughts, but I'm asking for the net because I know this is the point.
I do too, but I want to give space to others
Yeah.
to respond.
But no, I think since I've worked in schools my entire career, I think it's really fascinating how we talk about community partners. And oftentimes a school has community partners, but oftentimes organizations don't view schools as community partners. Because there are so many ways that you can employ youth to build, to contribute, but it seems like there isn't this mutual understanding or mutual trust that schools can be super effective community partners. I just wanted to give that note.
Love that. Yeah. So it's like there's a lot being stated about partnerships in general, but certainly community partners, but whether or not those communities feel like they have agency truly to actually partner with schools. And you could apply that to other sectors too, hospitals, whoever, that's powerful. Thank you for that. So if there was an action there, what's the action connected to your idea? My brain is very action oriented. As I mentioned, we want to make sure we have some advanced actionable knowledge.
Sure.
Great question.
I want to hear from Jackie. What's the action that you
The answer?
Yeah.
So I've seen this in partnerships with the University of Pennsylvania. Their nursing, the hospital, and a partnership with high schools called the Aspire program. So it's this, so having youth programming that gives students on the ground experience, but also fills a need in the organization. So something that's mutually beneficial, because students are craving meaningful, purposeful, hands-on learning. They are craving it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. Andrew, you were going to jump in?
Oh, sure. I think that I'm gonna I hate to answer a question with a question, but
Okay.
it's more of a rhetorical question, I guess, which is I want to know more about what a specific group of young people want and or need and sort of start from there, right? So for example, an obvious one would be linked to Jackie's work is I need some guidance on how to navigate this forest in front of me beyond high school. It's a forest of uncertain paths and unclear directions, and so I need that. Or I need some reassurance about the job market 5 to 10 years from now, and I need to be planful about it, especially with the advent of general AI, which I think many people are still not ready for. So it depends. I want to know, starting from the needs. So the examples that I gave earlier, you had young people agitating from a place of very broad needs in the South African case of just social justice and political power, period. And then in the local school district case, they wanted something specifically done about the mascot. But, you know, I think it's in other words, it should start with what the young people, what a particular group of young people want and or need, which I picked up from your framework.
Absolutely.
So that's my that's
Mhm.
my my initial thought anyway.
I love that feedback, and I would encourage us as we continue to work together, assuming that we're family. We're joined
Indeed.
at the hip here.
Mhm.
We keep that grounding around what young people need in their thoughts, because that's the problem. A lot of groups have forgotten that. And then also it reminds me, Andrew and family here, of a project a long time ago when I was in Atlanta earlier in my career working for a nonprofit called the Future Foundation. I had a project where I had to engage young people, and it was a simple research question. What do you need for your most promising future? That was it, in partnership with Emory University. And I mobilized the young people and, engaged Emory as the sort of group and managed that whole process. Was fascinated. Everything adults in the community thought completely opposite. The young people were in barbershops, they were in hair salons, they were, in parks, and they literally just asked each other, what do we need for our most promising future? The results would astound you. I don't have time to go into it today, but amplifying the results of that study that they led to commissioners in Atlanta and Fulton County, and they were able to shape a different type of solutions and investments that the current Atlanta mayor is still using, decades later, from that one conversation. So where did it start? With the needs of young people and us, busting, the myths around what adults and what people thought they needed. They thought it was simply about money, or I want to be an NBA player. It's so much deeper than that, right? And shame on us for not asking them all the time in a regular way. So I think that's what we're sort of moving toward as well. And we have to be the group to do that. I know we have 3 or 4 minutes left. Dr. Nakala.
I want to give you a quick, something you made me think of, this whole conversation made me think of trusting my own children. Because my wife and I had real assumptions about where our oldest son should go to college, what kind of college. And we took him to what we would consider from an adult perspective, a really good college with a good baseball team, that he wanted to be a college baseball player. So they were recruiting him hard. He went to one practice and said, I will never go to school here. These kids aren't athletes. They don't know. So he was prioritizing baseball over academics. He wanted to go to a junior college that had a good baseball program. And we ultimately dissuaded him from that. So he went to a bigger college to play baseball, got injured, and then went back to that junior college. We let him go there. And today, at 24 years old, he's the head coach of a varsity baseball team. He knew what he needed. We didn't necessarily trust his decision making, but he said, "Trust me. I know what I want and need." Ultimately, we did, and things are working out pretty well. But we would have never made the decisions he made.
That's a great example. And it reminds me of how, as a sector, we have to sort of study the implications for not trusting and listening to, and how it can be used as a tool to go back to what young people said in the first place. And so that's rich. That's a great example. I would love for your son. I think another piece is too inviting young people to actually speak in these settings to sort of lift up, voices from the field, if you will, around what it means when we actually implement this work well.
Right.
But
His job now as a young adult is to get the older adults to agree that he knows what he's doing for the baseball team.
right. Isn't that all young professionals, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, trust us now that we're in the world
Right.
working, right? That's great.
I
Thank
mean,
you so
the
much.
reason I use this example, Kimberlin, is I really see your talk. The part that has moved me most is your focus on deep trust. Easier to say than to do. And that's why I use the example of my son, because it's hard to do. It's hard to trust that deeply.
Yeah. One of the quotes or interviews that struck me in the study was, our job is simply to invest in the brilliance of other young people. We're just like, philanthropy needs to move out of the way and just trust them, and the investments should actually speak to that trust, right? And in one amazing example, they had worked with young people for a number of years and invited them back as consultants and contractors and pay them for the work. We hadn't even, there's so many ways we could go in this conversation. Getting into trusting young people and paying them for their voices is another symbol of trust, but consistently engaging them to say, you're going to be now consultant. So after school, you will come and do this and you will help us think, powerful example, right? So if more funders actually trusted in that way, imagine where some of these investments could go, right? On a regular basis in all spheres and sectors, right? So that's the call to kind of do that. But thank you all.